Number 10. Beer please. The late 1800s were an unusual time for the Russian Empire. While most of the world had begun modernizing 100 years prior, Russia was still living in the glory of its Tsarism, or so they thought. Like other countries before, the poor class were hungry, tired, and abused by their monarchy. Conditions were very poor, especially when compared to other nations. So when Nicholas II came to power after his father was known for his oppression, wanted to show the people he was different, and wanted to give a gift in honor of his coronation. He decided to feed the poor serfs who break their backs day and night. A large banquet was being organized for the people. However, the promise of some warm food and cold beer may have proved too promising, as chaos quickly came over the crowds, and over 1,000 people perished in a stampede. The Tsar went on that night to party with the French at a ball instead of grieving with the citizens who had perished. Strike one, Nikki. Number 9. Underdog. After Nicholas had begun to start modernizing Russia, it was clear that simply developing an industrial sector was not going to make the people happy. People were still hungry, had little rights, and now had really bad working conditions. So what's the one thing that could bring a nation together? You guessed it, war! Russia had been looking at expanding to the east, but so did a little empire called Japan. Russia figured that destroying a tiny country like Japan in war would make Russia feel pride and glory for its government. What could go wrong, right? Well, how about losing said war to a puny country like Japan? Like Russia, Japan had only begun to modernize a few decades prior, but unlike Russia, were more effective in doing so, which reflected on their military victories. Losing the war with Japan was a bad look for the Tsarship. Japan would go on to prove its might for years to come. Number 8. Oh Tsar, hear our pleas. Things were not looking good for old Nicky at this point. Civil unrest was growing rapidly, and the people had had enough. So one day an Orthodox priest named Father Gapon did something rather unorthodox. He and a bunch of workers with their families went on to the Winter Palace to deliver a petition. Peacefully. Basically saying, hey man, things have been kinda rough, can you cut us some slack? This is unusual because most times in history when people want change, there's usually more swords involved. However, the government responded in the best way imperial monarchs do, by firing volleys into the crowd, where another 200 people's lives were claimed. You can see how this isn't looking too good, right?
Number 7. Give us bread! The French Revolution very much erupted due to the financial distress of the people, but the tipping point was the moment bread became unattainable to the common Parisian. Bread is a huge thing in France, and it was a huge kind of staple meal for every Parisian. Marie Antoinette's famous misquoted response to the people asking for bread was, "Let them eat cake." Though it's debated whether she actually said that, it does summarize this yeasty flashpoint in history. They should have known better. In 1529, riots over grain and the Great Rebellion led to thousands of peasants destroying houses of the rich, all in the name of grain. But they didn't listen to their history, they made it worse. The king was counseled by the physiocrats since the 1760s, who firmly believed that the wealth of the nation was derived solely from the value of the land. Therefore, agricultural products should be highly priced. So they tried to intermittently deregulate the domestic trade to introduce free trade, but needless to say, they failed so hard. They caused food shortages and skyrocketed prices, which erupted in the Flour War, over 300 riots to pillage grain in 1775. Layers and layers of tensions were added, along with other economic distress and all this stuff added to the fuel of the blaze that would be later the French Revolution. Number 6. Flip a coin. Now, the royal family obviously didn't go willingly to their deaths. They at first tried to escape. As I previously mentioned, bread was a big deal, and on October 5th, 1789, a large crowd of mostly women began to assemble at the markets. Why were they there? To discuss the steep price of bread. But they were dismissed, so they marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles and stormed the place. They took out several guards and chanted over and over to the king, "Live among the people." Louis conceded, he said yeah okay, and agreed to go with them to Paris. Agreed, kind of. But meanwhile, the royal family was placed under protection, and on the night of June 1971, the nobles dressed as their servants and their servants dressed as them, and the nobles made an attempt to escape to Austria. Now, if it were 2021, the king would probably have some arrogant social media so everyone would know what he looked like, but the commoners outside didn't. They had no pictures of him, so it was the perfect disguise. But his face was on every coin in France, and it was because of this he was recognized at the border and sent back. Now we know what happened next. Number 5. Last words. While she was alive, Marie Antoinette was abhorred, absolutely detested, they hated her. But funny enough, today she's incredibly well loved. Historians believe that due to rumors and hatred of the time, her character was misinterpreted. What do I think? Well, she was the product of the aristocracy that pretty much poisoned their own well. She was a bystander. But one of the moments that leads people to believe in her kinder nature was her last words. As Marie Antoinette walked up to the guillotine on October 16, 1793, she stepped on the foot of her executioner by accident. Some say it was something else, but either way, her last words were reported as, "I'm sorry." Number 4. The Bastille. Bastille, Bastille, Bastille. What am I talking about? It seems wrong not to mention one of the most pivotal moments in the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. Peasants rose up and literally stormed the most famous prison in France. But what you may not know is that they destroyed that building with their own bare hands. They tore it brick from brick because they didn't have any explosives. The Bastille was a fearsome 100 feet high, 8-towered prison that became a symbol for the tyranny of the aristocrats. So it was only natural that they would take out their anger on this place. At dawn on July 14th, a crowd armed with only muskets, swords, makeshift weapons gathered around the Bastille. Their intent was to demand the ammunition stored there from the governor of the prison, the Marquis de Lanay. He and his men were eventually overwhelmed and the people stormed it. Lanay raised a white flag and surrendered. He and his men were taken into custody, gunpowder and cannons were seized, and 7 prisoners were freed. Lanay was destroyed by the mob before he even met trial. This pivotal moment in history is celebrated as the French national holiday, even today.
Number 3. Lenin Out. So after many years of fighting oppression and fighting to gain support of the people, with a little bit of bloodshed here and there, insert Russian Civil War here, Vladimir Lenin, the hero of communism, led his country for many years to come. Wrong. Unfortunately for the pointy-bearded man, his leadership would last about as long as a warm Russian summer. After suffering multiple strokes, his ability to lead was hindered, and with some classical irony, he gave history's second favorite Mustache Man the job of giving jobs, and said, "Whatever happens after I die, don't let him become the next leader." Oops. Number 2. Rasputin. Probably the most unusual person in history was Rasputin. Seemingly came out of nowhere during the Tsar's reign and quickly gained popularity in the streets as a holy healer. Nicholas II, having a son who was ill with hemophilia, saw an opportunity to heal his sick son's disease. That may or may not have been caused by inbreeding. So when Rasputin actually healed their son, it was a welcome miracle, which in truth, he might have just taken him off prescribed aspirin. Rasputin then came close to the royal family and enjoyed drinking their alcohol. Yet again for poor Nicky, this was just more bad publicity. Now, I don't know if you've been keeping score at home, sports fans, but if you add this up, your people are oppressed, your people are hungry, they lost a war to an itty-bitty country, Germany is kicking our butts in World War I, and Nicky's not taking responsibility for the loss of his citizens. And now a strange wizard man is partying with Russian royalty, who claims to be a healer, might be having an affair with the Tsar's wife. Somebody get this guy a PR manager. And number 1. You're a wizard, Rasputin. Rasputin's life was shrouded in mystery. Many things were said about the man. Some may be true and some are likely to be fiction. This includes his demise. His death was surrounded in myth. Or maybe not. I'm gonna give the editor a chance to pull up a picture of this guy and let the audience just look into his soul-devouring eyes. Right? Weird. So guys gotta go. A few officials invited Rasputin for tea and cake, which were poisoned of course. He ate them and, to the amateur assassin's shock, seemed okay. Rasputin went on to drink poisoned wine, and was fine. It wasn't until he was shot, and he tried to attack his assassins during said shooting, but eventually he ate 2 more bullets and was dumped into a river that looks ice cold even from the picture. Like previously mentioned, it may not all be true, but there certainly is some truth to this mysterious man. And while he may not have actually died like that, it keeps the myth alive, and seriously makes the Tsar look bad.
At number 10, sorry you died. Back during the Industrial Revolution, employers really didn't care about their employees. And when I say they didn't care, I really mean it. To them, their workers were pretty expendable and they didn't care about their safety at all. In fact, workers dying on the job was actually incredibly common. A lot of the time when a worker died on the job, they would be replaced so fast like nothing happened. On top of that, to make matters worse, when word got out of an employee being killed on the job, many newspapers would blame the victim for their own demise. Realistically, it's not their fault that they got hurt because their employers just didn't care about the well-being of their staff. To them, safety measures were just too expensive to care about, and making money mattered more to them than keeping their employees alive, so when one was out, another one was ready to come in and take their place. I can't say I would ever want to work for an establishment that was already thinking about the people they could bring in to replace me if I got hurt on the job. It's pretty dark when you think about it. At number 9, starting young. How old were you when you got your first job? I was 16 when I first started working, and my first job was in retail at an accessory store. It was kind of a nightmare around the holidays, but at least it was safer than working in a factory during the Industrial Revolution. Back then, anyone could get a job, even kids. Basically, to a lot of employers, if you could walk and talk, you could work. So a 30-year-old guy could end up working next to a 5-year-old. Back then, families were desperate to make money, so even the kids would be joining the workforce, with the youngest members of the family often being given the worst and most dangerous jobs. And if you think these kids would be cut some slack at work because they were so young, you would be mistaken. Everyone had to pull their own weight, even little 5-year-old Timmy. These kids were often forced to work 10 to 14-hour days, all whilst breathing in toxic fumes in factories and crawling into tight, dangerous spaces in coal mines. To make matters even worse for these kids, because they were working so much, they weren't able to go to school, and so when they grew up, the only jobs they would be qualified to do would be the same ones that they had been doing since childhood. Luckily, in the years since, child labor laws have been put in place to prevent this kind of exploitation. Before we carry on talking about the dark times of the Industrial Revolution, why not take a moment to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Big Boom. Remember how I mentioned how unsafe the working conditions were during the Industrial Revolution? Well, here's another case of workers being put in harm's way just to make a profit. Coal mining was a really big business back during the Industrial Revolution, but by that time, coal in the easy-to-reach places had already been mined. Now, just because things were getting more difficult as far as mining was concerned didn't mean that they were just going to stop, right? Miners had to keep going into deeper parts of the mines, and many of these places were quite unstable, which could lead to mine collapses. Many miners were injured or killed in mine collapses, but one of the more dangerous accidents that could happen were mine explosions. You see, as miners went into new parts of the tunnels, they could come across gas pockets. On top of that, miners back then used candles to light their way in mines, and as you could imagine, flammable gas pockets plus candle equal kaboom. Underground explosions were quite common, and as I mentioned before, casualties on the job meant nothing to employers, so it was all around just a sucky time to be in the mines.
Number 7. History's second favorite mustache. When Nicholas II had been making royal foul-up after royal foul-up, a group was organizing itself in the shadows. The Bolsheviks were tired of imperial reign and wanted change thanks to the help of a really good book they had read. Wanting to overthrow the government wouldn't be cheap, and they needed support. Enter history's second favorite mustache. His name rhymes with Joseph Stalin, who just so happened to be great at organizing and fundraising for the party. How did he fundraise, you ask? Oh, just your average amount of stealing, bank robbing, and other illicit activities. While history's second favorite Mustache Man was not a main character in the revolution's beginning, he would slowly rise to the ranks by completely dishonorable means. And although things had been really bad, once Stalin was caught and exiled, things were looking up for Nicky, as the economy began to recover. I'm sure if he just keeps down this path and maintains a good image, and doesn't do anything crazy like invite a crazy drunken wizard man into the royal palace, everything should be fine. Number 6. The war to end all wars. Just when things were improving, the world's biggest and most destructive conflict had broken out. At the time, Russia, having lost a tiny war with Japan, was totally ready to take on the most powerful nation on earth, right? It was clear that while Russia had effective soldiers, they were short of just about everything they needed to fight a war. What's strange, or rather very clever of the Germans, was to take Vladimir Lenin from Switzerland, he was in a timeout corner for trying to overthrow the government at the time, and send him back to Russia, where he would help destabilize the government and bring a quick end to the war, which it kinda worked out in the end. Number 5. The man with the dragon tattoo. Years before Nicky was Tsar and before Japan beat Russia in war games, the young Russian royal went to visit the land of cherry blossoms. Like most royals, the name of the game is public image, and as we know now, it is something he would struggle with. So what does a young royal do when visiting Asia abroad? Besides surviving an assassination attempt? Why, get a large dragon tattoo, of course. Yes, Nicholas got a very sizable dragon tattoo when he was in Japan. It stated he was always a fan of their culture and beauty. The dragon was considered a symbol of power and wisdom. Clearly not enough wisdom to start a war with Japan, and clearly something that wouldn't help his royal image, which if you couldn't tell by now is his underlying theme. Number 4. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. After a ton of not so fun times in Russia, Nicholas II abdicated his throne, and now multiple parties were trying to fill the power vacuum the Tsar had made in leaving. This is where the story gets silly, strap in folks. The political unrest and chaos at this time was, well, chaotic. And this is a long story short, but just when things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, a man named Alexander Kerensky was in charge. And after some more civil unrest, decided to arrest the socialists. To strengthen weakening relations with the military, he also made General Kornilov his second-hand man. Things were fine for about 3 seconds before Kornilov betrayed Kerensky. Kornilov, having control over the military, was coming for a power grab. Kerensky was forced to release and arm the socialists he had previously arrested, to aid in the defense against Kornilov. But the whole thing fell apart, and now the socialists were organized and armed. I don't know if you've noticed, but this is one crazy story. Note to self, don't give the people who want you dead a bunch of power and weapons.
At number 3, sucks to suck. As you can imagine, between the working conditions and the next to nothing pay, a lot of workers were pretty pissed off, especially with their employers. You would think that in this case the workers would just go and complain to their boss about things to try and help them out a little, but no. They couldn't, because it was illegal to demand better conditions. Pretty absurd, right? The Combinations Act of 1799 and 1800 were created as a means of stopping workers from demanding to be treated better. The acts made it illegal for workers to, quote, form societies or clubs for the purpose of political reform, or more specifically, trade unions which dared to request a rise in wages that was at least equal to the rise of the cost of living, end quote. This was an attempt from the British aristocracy to keep power away from the lower class citizens because they were afraid that they would rise up against them, which honestly they should have. Britain was, at this time, going through something of a rough patch, having just lost the American colonies and being at war with France at the time, so they wanted to be able to keep at least one thing in check. Luckily for the working class though, the Combinations Act only lasted until 1824 after the government acknowledged the level of irritation and distrust between employers and their employees. At number 2, on strike. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the US, working conditions were pretty bad over there as well, and in 1877 in West Virginia, a bunch of railroad workers said enough is enough and staged a strike demanding better working conditions and increased wages. As you would imagine, this didn't exactly go over well, and local officials appealed to the government to intervene in what they called an insurrection. Troops were then dispatched and a clash began, which resulted in 26 people losing their lives. This then escalated into a full-blown riot with people setting fire to railroads and buildings in retaliation. By the end of this 2-week strike, 100 people had died and the railroad industry made employees sign contracts banning unionization. And finally, at number 1, Ludites. As with any new advancement in society, there are always people who oppose this new thing that everyone is talking about. Some kind of new technology or other adaptation making significant changes in people's lives. These people are often called Ludites, and though some people still use this term these days, it actually has its origins in the Industrial Revolution. Back then, the Ludites were people who opposed this new technology and the invention of large machinery. They were so upset about these new machines that they decided to go out and just destroy them all. They blamed the machines for putting them out of work, and so they decided to put the machines out of service. It became such a huge problem that the British government created a law making the destruction of industrial machinery a criminal offense. Some people tried to test the government on this new law and continue destroying property, but the government really wasn't kidding, and in the same year that this law was put in place, 14 Ludites were hanged for frame breaking. I guess this served as a warning to all other Ludites out there, because after that the Ludite movement just died out.
Number 10, the cutting edge. So I feel like I have to start here because this really was the prima donna of the revolution. One of the reasons the French Revolution became such a bloody event was due to the guillotine. It became the primary symbol of the French Revolution as the peasants exacted revenge on the aristocracy. It became known as the National Razor and Madame la Guillotine. Prior to the events of the revolution, executions were much more violent and cruel, if you can believe that. One involved quartering, which we won't get into, but you can imagine how bad that is if you take that literally. But Dr. Joseph Guillotine, a member of the French National Assembly, argued that there should be a painless and private capital punishment, and even argued against capital punishment in general. He didn't want it to happen. So Dr. Guillotine, along with the German and a harpsichord maker Tobias Schmidt, invented the first prototype for the death machine. From there, the rest was history. It is estimated over 40,000 people were executed à la raison during the Reign of Terror. Pretty bad for a guy who really didn't want it to happen, but hey, at least it was painless. If the blade was sharp. If it wasn't, ugh. Number 9, the National Anthem. You know what's funny about going to theater school is that the more you learn, the more your teachers are like, hey, if something bad happens to you, you can use it. It's fuel for your art. Which is immediately what I thought of when I heard this story. Which is why, to me, it kind of makes sense that the origins of the French National Anthem happened during the French Revolution. They used their pain to make something good. Going through something dramatic? Sing about it. The monarchies of Europe were pretty pissed about the fact that they were killing a bunch of their friends and loved ones, so they formed a coalition to defeat the resistance and restore the monarchy. The French Baron Philippe Friedrich Dietrich requested that Roger de Lisle, another French officer, compose a song that would rally the troops. So he wrote the first anthem, called Chant de guerre pour l'armée de Rhin, which translates to War for the Army of Rhin. Volunteers carried the anthem all through the streets of Paris as they marched on the capital. The song title got subbed out for the simpler one called the Marseillaise, which became the Republic's anthem in 1795. And now, even today, it is the national anthem of France. Number 8, the tennis court oath. You'd think it would be like at a pub or on the street. Why I think that, I don't know, but it wasn't. One of the earliest acts of defiance in the French Revolution took place on a tennis court of all places. To say that Louis XVI was ill-equipped to handle the financial debt that his father and his grandfather built prior to his reign is kind of, well, it's an understatement. He had no clue. He made a desperate attempt in 1789 to address the economic issues by assembling the Estates Generales. It was a national assembly with 3 factions, each one representing either the nobles, the clergy, and the commoners. The third estates, which is the commoners, had the most members and declared themselves the National Assembly. There was a long list of overdue grievances, and they declared that they would force a new constitution on the king. Initially things were looking up as Louis legalized the assembly, but he locked them out of the damn meeting. So they moved to an indoor tennis court and took an oath to never disband until a new written constitution was formed for France. But very soon after that, they stormed the Bastille. But we'll get to the Bastille later.
At number 7, worst move. During the Industrial Revolution, we saw a lot of movement. Families were starting to uproot their lives in the countryside, on their farms, and in their cottages to move to more metropolitan areas to look for work. Many working families relocated in hopes of finding higher paying jobs, since these new machines were starting to put them out of work. For many, it sounded hopeful moving to the big city to find work and a high paying job, but in reality, life sucked. When these people moved, they learned that things weren't as great as they thought, and their wages sucked, and their workload was intense, not to mention incredibly dangerous. But once they got to the hustle and bustle, they couldn't leave and go back to their simpler lives. They were just in too deep. At number 6, Big Boom Part 2. Now, I talked about the mine explosions that were pretty common during the Industrial Revolution, but there were other workplace-related explosions as well. One of the other common explosions that affected workers quite often were boiler explosions. Because the factories that boosted the Industrial Revolution were powered by steam, boilers became a lethal side effect of this business boom. During the late 19th century, boiler explosions happened at an average of 1 explosion every 4 days. When these things would explode, not only would the boiler become airborne, but it would also blow coals from the boiler's fire pit everywhere and cause fires. Debris would also be an issue, as many workers would be pinned underneath it, and many were unable to escape the fires. Now imagine something like this happening every 4 days or so. You would go to work not knowing if you would make it home in one piece, and that is just terrifying. At number 5, Epidemic. With so many people flocking to the big city, sanitation became a big issue, and this is what caused the New York cholera epidemic in the summer of 1832. The illness had originated in Europe because of their meager rations and unsafe water, but when people started leaving Europe, heading to the US during the Industrial Revolution, the illness came with them and it spread like wildfire. It came to the point where things were getting so bad and so many people were dying from the illness that many families in New York just packed up and left. People just didn't want to take their chances with the sickness, and so many of them headed down the Hudson to small villages. By the end of that summer, so many people had left New York that the population dropped by nearly 50%, as 100,000 of the 250,000 people in the area had moved away. At number 4, Erie Canal. Because the production of goods skyrocketed during the Industrial Revolution, people started having trouble figuring out how to move it. See, the people in the local area couldn't afford to buy whatever was being produced because they were all making crappy wages, and so they had to ship the goods to other places where people could afford to buy them. This ended up posing a bit of a problem because they didn't know how to get this merchandise from point A to point B. This is what prompted the idea to build the Erie Canal, making it possible to ship things from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. This massive job took 8 years and 50,000 workers to complete, and it wasn't an easy task, but then again, nothing back then was an easy task, and danger, injury, and your possible demise was just part of the job. Out of the 50,000 workers it took to build the canal, 10,000 workers died. That's about 1 in 50 people. It was a pretty dangerous job, to say the least.
Number 3, Charlotte Corday, assassin of Marat. So we have established a couple things. One is that the French Revolution was bloody, relentless, and pretty terrifying. As much as it proved the statement that people shouldn't be afraid of their governments, but the other way around, Alan Moore, V for Vendetta, it wasn't a great place to be. Enter Charlotte Corday. Charlotte was a passionate supporter of the revolution, even though its main conspirators were set on killing the likes of her. Charlotte was, after all, a noblewoman, though she opposed the reign of terror. There were two sides to the fray, the Girondists and the Jacobins, and Charlotte fought alongside the first, the Girondists. But the Jacobins were radical and tried to kill any and all oppositionists, the Girondists included, which is why Charlotte decided that Jean-Paul Marat, leader of the Jacobins, had to be taken out. She became an assassin. While Marat was taking a bath, Charlotte stormed in. She bought a knife and, disguised as an informant, went in to speak with him. She said she had news. At first, she delivered on her offer and told him of the escaped Girondists. He at once said that they would be guillotined, and so she whipped out her knife and popped his bath bubbles for good. Corday knew she was going to be caught, however, and had told no one, not even her family, her plan, so they wouldn't stop her. Charlotte was guillotined July 17, 1793 with her name attached to her dress so she would be recognized. She wrote in a letter explaining her actions, "I desire only that my head, carried through Paris, may be a rallying standard for all the friends of the law." Number 2, public zoo. Did you know that in the middle of all that crazy turmoil and public executions, they managed to find time to open a public zoo? In 1793, the National Assembly declared that all privately owned exotic animals will be transferred to the menagerie at the Palace of Versailles, or killed, stuffed, and donated to scientists. Gladly though, the animals' lives were spared and the menagerie was reopened as a zoo. It was free to the public and peasants got to go see exotic animals for the first time. Jacques-Henri Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, the founder, passionately believed that the public should be educated about exotic animals. Now, I can't be sure how well the animals were treated, I assume it wasn't very great, but this was technically the first zoo. Number 1, Maximilian Robespierre. Now, it only seems fitting that we end this list at the end. Maximilian Robespierre started out with good intentions, but even though the revolution was about the dismantling of power, Maximilian became corrupted by it. Yes, he did topple the monarchy and put the power back to the people, but then he took it back for himself and got a little crazy, you know, the whole thing. Robespierre worked as a lawyer in France and focused a lot of his cases towards the underprivileged classes. This got him a lot of popularity, and he eventually rose to be the poster child of the revolution, the leader of the revolution. He became the head of public safety after Louis and Marie lost their heads, and continued to accuse many members of the National Convention of treasonous and unrevolutionary activities all over the place. Remember the whole thing between the Girondists and the Jacobins? This was that. In less than a year, 300,000 people were arrested, 10,000 died in prison, and 17,000 were guillotined. I think those numbers might be slightly off, but that's kind of what the research said. One by one, he sent them all to the guillotine until he eventually was elected the president of the National Convention. Within 6 days, he passed a law that suspended the right to a public trial and to legal assistance, and by the end of that month, 1,400 were guillotined. Talk about trigger happy. Finally, the right and the left had to reunite in order to overthrow him, and he was eventually met the blade himself. Kind of crazy how full circle that is.